Hello and welcome to episode 268 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick here, as always, with
Jason Rabinowitz. Hello, Ian. How are you today?
I'm well, Jason. How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. We've got a long list of interesting things this week. Some expected, some unexpected, some just things.
Some just things. Yeah, it's a big week. We've finally reached the culmination of months, years maybe, of trying to get this across the line. The bill to reauthorize the FAA has passed, so we'll talk about that in just a minute. We've got some good order news to report, some interesting operational changes, but we get to once again start with bad news for Boeing.
Yes, bad news that we probably knew was coming, but it may not have been coming. But now we know something's coming for Boeing. And that would be in the form of the DOJ saying that Boeing did indeed breach its deferred prosecution agreement after the two crashes of the 737 MAX years ago. As we remember, calling back a few episodes now, that the deferred prosecution agreement expired mere days after the Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 door plug blowout, and that kind of triggered some very not good things for Boeing, possibly. Ian, what did the DOJ have to say?
So the DOJ sent a letter to the judge in the case that supervised the original deferred prosecution agreement. It also sent a letter to people that have been termed crime victims based on the charging documents in the case. And both of those documents say that the Department of Justice has determined that Boeing breached its obligations under the deferred prosecution agreement. And it lists the specific, paragraphs and subsections of what they say Boeing failed to live up to. But they say that they did that by, quote, failing to design, implement, and enforce a compliance and ethics program to prevent and detect violation of the U.S. fraud laws throughout its operations.
And we don't know the details of exactly what the DOJ thinks triggers this. Was it the missing bolts in the door plug? Was it the non-compliance of how they were assembling 787 parts by jumping on them or whatever? Was it, probably not that one, but was it Boeing employees lying about doing inspections required on the 787? I think we talked about that last week or the week before. We don't know the details. We just know that the DOJ says Boeing has done something or multiple things that violates its deferred prosecution agreement. We should know sometime next month what this actually means, what the actions the DOJ will take, because right now, I don't think we know much of anything or what's even on the table.
We don't yet know what the Department of Justice is saying Boeing did specifically to violate the deferred prosecution agreement. And we also don't know what the Department of Justice is going to do about it. Because the DOJ is saying they failed to live up to their end of the DPA, Boeing can now be prosecuted by the U.S. for any violation which the U.S. can find. And as we've talked about over the past few weeks, it sounds like there's more than one. So it remains to be seen whether they go back and talk about the original charging documents for this case, or whether they just move on to additional kind of after the fact violations of the DPA. For its part, Boeing said this: "We can confirm that we received a communication today from the Justice Department stating that the department has made a determination that we have not met our obligations under our 2021 deferred prosecution agreement and requesting the company's response." I'll stop here from the quote to say that Boeing has 30 days to respond to the DOJ's accusation that it failed to live up to, or determination that it failed to live up to its end of the DPA. Boeing gets a month to respond to that. Boeing continues, quote, "We believe that we have honored the terms of that agreement and look forward to the opportunity to respond to the department on this issue. As we do so, we will engage with the department with the utmost transparency, as we have throughout the entire term of the agreement, including in response to their questions following the Alaska Airlines 1282 accident." So Boeing, for its part, says, hey, we did what we were supposed to do. We've been doing what we're supposed to be doing, and we're going to clear our name. So we'll see what happens. Boeing's response is due to the DOJ by the middle of June. And sometime next month, we'll have a better understanding about where we stand and what the DOJ sees as its options. That'll be the most interesting part.
Yeah, of course, Boeing is going to defend itself and say we don't believe we violated anything. But I think it's pretty clear that there are violations left and right here. To what degree those might violate the DPA, that's up to the DOJ. A lot of 3-letter abbreviations here, but
it's aviation. You have to have abbreviations.
Yeah, the DOJ has to tell everyone what they think Boeing did to violate it and who violated it and what the possible repercussions of that might be. Their prosecutors will basically decide, what are we going to move forward with? What are we going to charge Boeing with, basically? I do think it's interesting that there are those who back in 2021 said, I think with hindsight accurately, said that a deferred prosecution agreement lets Boeing off the hook, and that if no one will have to suffer any sort of consequences here, no one has to go to jail or whatever, take personal responsibility for their actions, nothing will change at Boeing, no matter how much they say it will change. And lo and behold, here we are 3 years later, we're right back to where we were. Things have not meaningfully changed. If anything, they've got meaningfully worse since then. But I don't really think anyone at Boeing in 2021 would have thought this deferred prosecution agreement would have come back full circle to bite them once again. That's pretty much unthinkable that would have happened. The whole point of these is basically you're let off the hook, just be on your best behavior, and they couldn't even do that.
Just promise not to do it again.
Oh, and pay 2 point whatever billion dollars. There was also that.
Yeah, in a way, because they got to roll in the compensation that they were going to pay to the airlines anyway as part of this.
Yeah, Boeing was let off the hook, but that hook has been put right back into Boeing, and we'll see what happens. But it should be within the next month or so.
Let's stick with Boeing. We've got some delivery numbers for April. It was the lowest amount of deliveries in 2 years from Boeing. That's mainly due to the slowed rate of 737 deliveries and 737 production as they attempt to minimize traveled work. That's work performed out of sequence. Boeing has had a lot of problems with that, which has led to quality issues. So they're trying to get in on that. And we talked pretty extensively about that last episode when we talked about Spirit and their new inspection regime. On the bright side of the delivery calendar, the 1,500th 737 MAX was delivered to Ryanair on the 24th.
Surprise.
When we say this, I always try and find the best language, because you would be forgiven if you thought I meant that 1,500 737 MAXs have been delivered to Ryanair.
You'd be forgiven for thinking
that. Doesn't seem out of the question, but not yet. This is just the 1,500th overall. It's
a big number and it deserves celebration. It's crazy that the 737 is still around for 1,500 and probably 2,000, but it's something to celebrate regardless of everything else that's happening in Boeing. That's pretty amazing.
I mean, at the current backlog, we'll go well over 5,000.
That's absurd, I think. But yeah, it's a lot of airplanes. A lot of airplanes in that backlog with nothing to replace it.
Yeah. There's more than 4,000 737 MAX in the backlog and nearly or just over 700 787s. So that's a number to keep an eye on as well. Okay, let us go to Washington, D.C. And soon we'll be able to do that from a few new airports. Jason, do you want to do FAA and safety stuff, or do you want to get into the DCA slots first?
Let's do the big FAA, the meaty stuff first, but then we can get to DCA.
Sure. So this is the bill that we didn't know if it was going to get through both houses of Congress, if they were going to agree enough to get it onto the president's desk. But alas, they did. The House passed the FAA Reauthorization Act. Today, it will go to the president's desk. The president said that he is going to sign it, and thus the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024 will become law. All 1,000 plus pages of it.
Whatever other junk they managed to cram into that bill.
I mean, having read most, I'm not proud of this, but I've read most of the bill. And there's some interesting things in here that definitely seem like pet projects that somebody wanted to sneak in. But for the most part, there's, some pretty straightforward stuff.
5 years is a big deal. No more 1 month extensions or 1 year.
Exactly.
5 years is the real deal, folks.
Exactly. A lot of the reauthorization deals with safety, providing funds for increased safety on runways, on taxiways, in the air, anywhere on the airport where you can study a way to make it safer, whether that's runway incursions, air prox incidents, FOD on various taxiways, and how to safely deal with that, including even possibly automating how FOD is detected. So FOD, for those listening that are going, what is he talking about? Foreign object debris. So stuff that's there that's not supposed to be there. They're even investigating automated detection of that. So lots of stuff that is designed to either increase safety through just adding more technology or increase safety eventually by creating study and working groups and committees that will recommend best practices to eventually increase safety. So a lot of funding for those things. Also funding for additional air traffic controllers, also funding for modernization of technology in the air traffic control network, all sorts of additional funding. It's all about money, Jason.
That's good news. And you know who, along with the NTSB, also got reauthorized? Our good friends at the NTSB.
Yeah, FAA reauthorization, NTSB reauthorization. Chair Jennifer Homendy has been reconfirmed for another term, which is
right. Good for her.
Always good to have fully confirmed heads of major agencies, which is something that we've sorely been lacking for the last few years in a lot of places, including, before Mike Whitaker at the FAA. So this is generally all good news. Some interesting stuff related to increasing safety through studying things like how to increase the use of weather cameras so that pilots can be more aware of kind of the weather conditions, crash-resistant fuel systems, reducing turbulence, how does radiation impact passengers and crew. A big one are lithium batteries, continued research on how to increase safety based around those, all sorts of really good, fun things. Thousands and thousands of pages of important and some less important items, but good to see that this passed.
Yeah. Speaking of less important items, somehow everyone's favorite DC adjacent airport, DCA, became a really big factor in the whole FAA reauthorization bill because, of course, there can't be anything in DC without the federal authorities controlling it for no real reason. But DCA is one of those few airports in the US that is strictly slot controlled, like LaGuardia, like JFK. If you do not have a slot, you cannot typically operate to DCA. And somehow in the reauthorization bill became this whole push and pull of, does an increase of the number of slots for DCA get increased or not? And Ian, what is the number we ended up with?
You get 10 slots divided 8 and 2.
That's exciting.
Yeah, so this is an interesting kind of thing that has happened. The bill grants 10 exemptions. So, Jason, can you explain the perimeter rule for those that might not know?
The perimeter rule is a long-standing rule, which I think you really only find at DCA and LaGuardia. LaGuardia in New York, it's a locally imposed thing by the airport authority. No big deal. But at DCA, it is a federally mandated thing that flights past a certain perimeter, I think it's 850 miles, something along those lines.
1,250.
So close. 1,250. Wasn't close at all. Beyond that, there used to be no flights beyond that perimeter. You could fly anywhere up to and including that line. But more recently, in recent years, there have been some exemptions. So you do get flights outside of DCA of that perimeter to places like Los Angeles. There are some very small handful of flights. But all 10 of these new slots, I believe, or was it 8 or all 10? I'm not clear on that. But at least 8, if not all 10, will be slot exemption flights, which is actually pretty exciting.
Yeah, so all 10 are slot exemption flights. 8 are...
This is where it gets confusing.
Yeah, this is where it gets confusing. They couldn't just say, here's 10 new slots. 8 slot exemptions are made available to incumbent air carriers qualifying as non-limited incumbent carriers at DCA, and 2 slot exemptions are to be made available to incumbent air carriers qualifying as limited incumbent carriers. So this is one of those... This is one of those where we couldn't make it as simple as possible. We had to make it as complicated as possible. So it's, I guess, good news for those airlines that want the slots, but there was a lot of pushback from DC area Congress people and DC area people in
lobbying
general.
Groups and all sorts of things. Well, this is always a highly contentious topic because, as you may know, DC is the seat of the federal government here in the US, and those in federal government like to go home on Friday afternoon or Thursday afternoon and get there as quickly and easily as possible, preferably without connecting flights. And at a DCA, if you're going beyond 1,250 miles, apparently, thank you, Ian, you can't do that nonstop at a DCA. So there's this really big push and pull between federal lawmakers who want more flights beyond the perimeter and federal lawmakers who do not want that to happen because they are afraid they might lose their flights within the perimeter to gain flights outside of the perimeter. I mean, there's even a lobbying group called the Coalition to Protect America's Regional Airports. I mean, if we can add an echo effect in the background there, that would be good. But the CPARA, as they call themselves, was very adamant and sent me many dozens of emails over the past few weeks about this topic. And they are very, very upset that these 10 additional DCA flights in the final bill, and I quote, will undoubtedly lead to further delays, cancellations, and congestion on America's busiest runways. Thanks to their efforts, though, that outcome was not worse. So it could have been worse. At some point, I think the number was a lot higher than 10. But I'm sure if you looked at who is behind the funding for the Coalition to Protect America's Regional Airports, I'm sure you might find some airlines that might actually be hubbed there at DCA. But speaking of which, almost immediately after this bill was put onto the president's desk to sign, we already have airlines and airports putting out press releases saying, we want to be first. And that would be, at least first, would be American Airlines and San Antonio International Airport saying they want to be the first airport and airline to put forward an application to the U.S. Department of Transportation to initiate service between San Antonio and DCA. Not terribly surprising. I think there are some prominent Texan lawmakers who are pushing for this one in particular, but that did not take long.
As soon as it passed, they were ready to go. I applaud their efforts, honestly.
Yeah, sure. Now it's up to the Department of Transportation to divvy out these precious new slots and figure out who incumbent or what were the terms?
Limited, incumbent, and non-limited. It basically talks about how many slots you have. So there's what was it? The chairman
flight. That was out of Newark where tit for tat, there was this whole bribery scheme. I don't know how we ended up talking about this, but the CEO of United at one point was promised I believe it was a new hangar at Newark and a rail extension of the PATH train to Newark Airport, which I still think is badly needed in exchange for United operating an incredibly unnecessary flight on like Thursday afternoons and Sunday afternoon only to the resort or the beach home regional airport of one of the port authorities directors or something like that. So you operate me this needless flight once a week to my house and I'll give you what you want in return. Not quite like that in this case. And
No, it just came to mind.
That one predates the podcast even.
Yeah, I mean, there's just something that can happen when slots are involved. Okay, let's leave the US and head to India, where the Economic Times of India is reporting that IndiGo could add up to 100 small regional-sized aircraft to its fleet, most likely the ATR-72, because it already operates a large number of ATR-72s, and sticking with the same aircraft seems likely, though the A220 and Embraer jets are ostensibly in the running. This comes, well, very soon after IndiGo said, you know what? Let's take up to 100 A350. So really, really continuing to expand. And then not long after, in contract terms, of them saying, we're going to order 500 A320neo family aircraft. So
big expansion.
So many planes. So many planes.
Yeah, we don't talk about ATR all that often. I mean, it's really like a mini Airbus or whatever right now. But yeah, we don't talk about ATR. You don't hear much about their manufacturing issues, if any exist. I really don't know even what their production rate is, but it sounds like they might need to crank it up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that could be possible. We'll keep an eye on that to see if IndiGo does, in fact, make that order. We're keeping an eye on the calendar because Farnborough is coming up in the next few months. Jason, you flagged this one the other day, and your take on it I thought was worth bringing back up in the podcast because it's rare that an airline says, we know what we're about, and that's what we're going to keep doing.
Yeah, that is rare. And we've seen it lead, the lack of this awareness lead to the demise of many airlines in the past, most notably Norwegian, I think we all know. But here we have an article from Flight Global about Cebu Pacific, an airline you don't hear all that much about these days. But an interview, or I think this was a part of their investor day or something along those lines. But Cebu Pacific does have some limited long-haul operations, but in the face of seeing success of other airlines operating long-haul from the Philippines to North America and further into Europe, Cebu Pacific's current CEO said, nah, we're good. We're good. We don't need to do that. And actually, the quote is, it's not what we do. It's not in our DNA. So that is really interesting to see a potential short-term source of profit, money. Other airlines are doing it. Why not you too? But apparently, no, Cebu Pacific, they're really focused on their 4-hour ring around the country, but also they do have some long-haul flights out to, I think, like Dubai and Australia, but those are kind of ancillary on the side, not really their focus. But it's just nice to see an airline that knows what it does, is good at it, is making money, and has the willpower to not fall into the trap of overexpanding into long haul and then just ceasing to exist.
Can you imagine taking a Cebu flight for 10 hours?
I mean, yeah, because you could do that today if you wanted. You could fly them to Dubai. I think it's like over 9 hours. But that is for a very specific set of airline passengers. That's not really a leisure route or anything. That's for workers to get back and forth. But do I want to fly Cebu Pacific from, let's say, New York or LA to the Philippines? Absolutely not. That would be awful, I think, in the current configuration of its aircraft. But that's not what they're doing, so I don't have to worry about it.
I mean, for those that don't know, Cebu Pacific, I think, seats 9 trillion people on an A330neo.
That sounds right.
459 seats.
That is a lot.
An A330 900.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of people in a single class configuration.
459. Yeah, that is more than Lion Air on the A330-300 at 440. Tops its own fleet, Cebu Pacific, the A330-300 at 436. The next airline that comes anywhere close is Batik Air at 392. It's like a whole other class of its own. It's impressive how many people they put on that airplane.
To put into context, a 3-class configuration A380 is roughly 535 passengers.
Yeah, but if you're Singapore, it's like 200 something.
It's actually just one guy. One guy.
That sounds right.
380. Sad news to report: Air Vanuatu has ceased operations.
Oh, their one airplane, or one 737 apparently, has been repossessed The airline is being liquidated, rather short notice, unfortunately. As of May 9th, the airline has ceased operations with immediate effect. They are pleading with customers to not travel to the airport unless you've rearranged travel. And that's really unfortunate.
Yeah. We've seen this before with single aircraft airlines. It's not necessarily going to work out.
Well, that single aircraft has also not moved since January, I think. It's been in Melbourne in Australia since then. So I guess they've been wet leasing other aircraft to fill in. But the one aircraft that isn't even in Vanuatu right now has been repossessed, which is pretty much the end of the airline, which is not great. That's the second airline in that region of the world we've talked about in the last 2 weeks to go belly up.
Yeah. Coming back closer to home for us, we could have a Breeze Airways copy in the next few months, year. We'll see.
Sure.
Zoom Airlines is basically a Breeze copy, same business model. We want A220s, but we'll settle for Embraer E-Jets before we get the A220s. And we'll fly to secondary markets and then do other stuff.
I mean, sure. We see that there's money to be made there. I think this quarter, Breeze made its first profit or turned its first profit. So that's good. So it has proven the model. But that model might not work if someone else copies them and does the same thing in the same markets with the same exact airplanes, although Breeze will be phasing out its E190s. Man, would it be ironic if this new startup that may or may not happen takes those E190s and operates its own fleet with those same aircraft.
Hilarious.
There are a lot of E190s available now between Breeze retiring most of them and also JetBlue retiring its entire E190 fleet within the next year or two. They're out there. They are expensive aircraft to operate. But if you got nothing else, why not name yourself after a defunct Canadian airline and give it a shot?
I'm a huge fan of naming myself after defunct Canadian airlines.
Yeah, they had a Zoom Airlines of Canada between 2002 and 2008. Not a long run. Had a wider range network than I thought, flying all the way to multiple destinations in Europe, South America, Caribbean, even Thailand at one point. I don't think the new Zoom Airlines will be doing quite the same thing with a fleet of E190s unless they stop about 17 times. But yeah, renaming yourself after a not that long gone Canadian airline is an interesting decision.
I'm looking at the old Zoom fleet. It looks very colorful.
Very similar, too.
Lots of blue. They could pull those old 767s out.
I am 100% in favor of that.
Sadly, I think most of them have been converted to cargo. Alas.
Of course, they have. Find a 763 that hasn't been converted to cargo. Actually, it is operating right now with CargoJet in Canada still. So that checks out.
This is one that is interesting because we didn't think it would happen, but now SkyWest is going to operate CRJ 550s on behalf of Delta.
And if you are anywhere outside of the US, you're probably saying, what the heck is a CRJ 550? That's not real. That's not a real thing. Ian, what's a CRJ 550?
So a CRJ 550 is a CRJ 700 that's had a bunch of seats removed to remove density and bring it under or at a 50-seat regional jet.
So it's just a 700 with like a mask on, saying, I'm actually a CRJ 200. Fooled you.
Exactly. And why they did this was basically we being United, needed to cut down on the number of seats in order to operate them as 50-seat jets, but they wanted to have a more premium heavy configuration. So then they went from the 700 down to what they call the 550. And now SkyWest is going to operate them for Delta. But this is interesting because didn't United own the intellectual property on the 550?
It is interesting. So United's CRJ-550s are actually operated by GoJet Airlines, not a very large regional operator. SkyWest, much larger regional operator in the U.S. I think they're the largest regional operator,
They
probably
are,
anywhere,
in fact, the largest.
by
Yes.
a wide margin. But at the time, United, this comes to us from Seth Miller over at PaxX.aero, back in 2019, when this was a big deal right before COVID, interviewed or got a quote from United saying, could others try? Murphy acknowledges that it's possible, though points out the regulatory and certification challenges were a significant hurdle to overcome. And basically says, quote again, I'm not planning on us doing anything for anyone. I'm pretty competitive and I don't want to let this one go. Someone might try to replicate it, but it isn't easy. Well, it took 5 years, but somebody did it. SkyWest will be putting, I think, 17 of them in service for Delta, which is interesting because Delta hasn't really acknowledged this. They put a seat map, interestingly, on its fleet page, but it hasn't said anything else about this aircraft, about where it's going to go, when it's going to start operating. But there's a seat map, so it must be coming. But it's a win for passengers. The CRJ 550 is the luxury liner of regional jets. They are fantastic, questionable in the face of eco concerns, taking a aircraft that can hold 76 passengers and loading it up only with 50 is a bit questionable. I'm surprised the U.S. airlines aren't getting a little more pushback about that. But having flown on it on United a number of times, it's a fantastic experience.
Yeah, I mean, it works for what it is, and I think that I've never heard anyone say anything bad about it.
Because you can't.
As far as the experience goes.
I mean, it would be better if it was, let's take an E175 and call it an E150 or something like that, and only have 50 people on an E-jet. That would be even better, because everybody prefers an E-jet to a CRJ. There is not a single person out there that would say, I'd prefer a CRJ 900 over an E175. You could fight me on that. It's not a thing. It doesn't exist.
Email us at podcast@fr24.com.
Even if you do email us, you're wrong. I'm sorry, but you're wrong. But the 550 is a nice way to fly.
All right, Jason, this next story, I'm just going to get out of your way.
Okay, well, we're going back to Canada to find a missing link. That's it. That's all I'm going to say, because that's all you wanted me to say.
Boo.
Okay, well, I'll continue.
Keep going.
WestJet, in its quest to consolidate all of the things it split out from itself, will be transitioning WestJet Link into WestJet Encore. You're following me? So there's WestJet Link and there's WestJet Encore. Link is actually operated not by Encore and not even by WestJet aircraft at all, but by, Pacific Coastal Airlines out on the west coast of Canada on pretty small aircraft. I think they were Saab 340s, only 30-something seats on board those aircraft. But now those routes will be moved over to WestJet Encore, who operates the Dash 8 Q400. And that's a sizable increase in the number of seats on board.
That's a lot of seats.
That goes from like 30-something to 70-something. But I'm sure there will be frequency reductions in light of that, which actually could not be great for some of these airports. If you go from 3 flights a day down to 1, that could be quite problematic. But yeah, there's a missing link at WestJet now. That's all you wanted me to say. I know.
All I wanted you to say.
Well, I said it.
This is a story that I thought we had talked about weeks ago.
We forgot.
So we had an astute Irish listener write in with an article that was picked up long before it broke into the aviation press. It was in the Irish labor union press. The story about IAG shifting the first A321XLR to Iberia. So pilots at Aer Lingus are currently in not so genteel negotiations with the airline over pay and benefits. And because of this continued negotiations, Aer Lingus has said, we're not in a position to accept the A321XLR. IAG says, not a problem. Iberia, here you go. So it seems now that the first A321XLR later this year will be delivered to Iberia instead of Aer Lingus.
That's one way to do it, I guess. It seems like Aer Lingus never gets the benefit of new airplanes. Or once upon a time, they were supposed to operate A350s. Never happened. Here you go with the 321 XLR. Not going to happen. Even though they are already aircraft that have been produced and in Aer Lingus livery out at the Airbus facilities. I think there are 2 already.
Yep.
Guess they're going to have to put a couple new coats of paint on that or whatever.
Just leave the shamrock and slap an Iberia. It's all Euro white. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, no big deal. But Aer Lingus would have been well suited to operate the 321 XLR, complementing its existing 321 LR. Don't know what Iberia is going to do with it. Hopefully they do something more interesting than ITA operating the 321 LR from like Rome to London or other nonsense like that. I guess they're going to have to scramble to find a plan for these aircraft in Madrid.
Madrid to Miami, or
why not Barcelona?
There, I'm sure those will be the first routes.
Mm-hmm.
Madrid, Barcelona, Madrid, London. I mean, because remember, I was at BA was operating its A380s, London, Madrid, when they were first bringing them back into service.
It was also common up until COVID for Iberia to operate the whatever they had up to the A340-600, even between Madrid and London daily.
Yeah.
So that could be fun.
Lots and lots of flying to do. So we'll keep an eye on this one. We'll see if it actually happens, if this is a negotiating tactic, what's going on here. Nothing seems to be set in stone just quite yet, but it's definitely something we're keeping an eye on. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I think, the United States government announced a contract to Sierra Nevada Corporation for the procurement of the replacement for the E-4B Nightwatch aircraft. So these are currently modified 747-200s that act as command and control aircraft in the event of nuclear war, among other things.
Call them by their nickname. That's not what we call them.
You want me to call them the Doomsday Planes?
You need to call them the Doomsday Plane. Come on.
Okay, fine. The Doomsday Planes.
There we go. Continue. Thank you.
We didn't know where the aircraft were going to come from. There are currently a handful of 747-200s that are in need of replacement. And looking around, we didn't know where the airframes would come from. Now we know, because Korean Airlines is selling 5 of its 747-8Is to Sierra Nevada Corporation. I mean, I assume they could use them for something else, but to me, this seems
unlikely.
When you see hoof prints, think horses kind of thing.
Yeah, Sierra Nevada has not done modifications on aircraft of this size before, so it would be very surprising if they turned around and did anything else with these.
So these aircraft are scheduled to come into service in a few years' time. They are going to be completely stripped of everything and made new. And then they will be the new Doomsday aircraft.
Yeah, it is just very funny to me that now both the Air Force One replacements and the Doomsday plane replacements will both be not purpose-built aircraft, but really just refurbishing gently used aircraft, or in this case, not even gently used. The Air Force One replacements, those were not taken up aircraft. They never entered commercial service, but these probably have a couple million miles on them, which is good for them.
I mean, it'll work as Korean Air winds down its four-engined passenger fleet. Speaking of winding down four-engined fleets, NASA today retired the DC-8. The DC-8 flying laboratory, which has been around for 37 years.
Wow.
Operated by and for NASA over the course of 4 decades. It has been at the forefront of such famous films as Sniffing the Exhaust from a variety of aircraft.
Is that the title of that film?
Yes, that was the title of the film.
Okay, gotcha.
Following other aircraft around to practice precision landing approaches in a multi-aircraft configuration. Most recently, folks in the US, South Korea, and other parts of Asia were delighted, and some folks dismayed, by the DC-8 flying extremely low over major US cities, sampling air pollution and particulate matter. So this aircraft has been very busy up until retirement. It is now going to continue to be busy at Idaho State University, where it will be used by their aviation maintenance programs as a trainer aircraft. Fret not, there is a replacement on the way. An ex-Japan Airlines 777-200ER, which flew for Japan Airlines under the registration JA704J, is currently at NASA's facility in Langley, undergoing what I can only assume is complete and utter teardown as they add sensors and fresh window ports and all sorts of things to the aircraft to prepare it for its first operational mission sometime in fiscal year 2026. At least that's what the schedule says now. We'll see how we can keep to that.
Yeah, and the DC-8, after it took off from Edwards Air Force Base, I believe, did a little flyover in a couple places, actually. Actually, it took off from north of Palmdale. What was this? Palmdale U.S. Air Force Base, and then it went over to Edwards. Then it actually went west instead of north over to San Jose. Did either, not sure if it was a touch and go or a low-level flyby over San Jose, which is pretty cool. Finally, before making his trip east and landing out in Idaho, again, doing a nice circuit of the local area before finally touching down one last time. Not a phrase you will say many times moving forward, retiring its final DC-8. There are more out there, but I think we might only get to say that one more time. It's that Samaritan's Purse DC-8, and I think that's probably
And then
it.
there's Aero Cargo Bus Aero something. And I think they have two, and I think one is operational at any one time. So yeah, it's a dwindling number for sure. We're less than a handful of DC-8s for sure.
I look forward to having the same conversation in 40 years when we say that NASA's 777-200ER is the last operating and is about to retire. I feel like this one's going to be around a very long time.
A very, very long time. Yeah.
And it's not even a particularly spry aircraft right now. It's pretty, I mean, any 777-200ER is going to be quite old at this point, but this particular frame is, do we know how old this one is?
Probably.
Somebody must know.
I assume I could look this information up. It was delivered in 2003.
Okay, so it's up there already.
Yeah. So not young, but it's getting a full facelift. So it'll be ready to go. This is a story that we would talk about much higher up in the show if we knew more and if it had ended differently. And so we'll just leave this here near the bottom of the show and come back to it, I'm sure, when we have more information. United Flight 28 from Singapore to San Francisco experienced what we now believe to be an uncontained engine failure of its left engine not long after departing Singapore on the 14th of May. The aircraft returned safely back to Singapore for an uneventful landing, where a puncture hole was found in the engine case and engine casing. So that's really all we know at this point. The NTSB, to my knowledge, as of the 15th of May, has not said it's investigating. Singapore hasn't said much, and the FAA hasn't said anything, as far as I know. So I'm sure that'll change as soon as we hit stop on the recording, but we'll have more to say about this likely next week when we know more about what happened. And then to close out the show, we've got a recap of the iconic aircraft. We asked everyone to email us what their most iconic aircraft was, what they thought the most iconic aircraft was. We kept it commercial, and as I assumed would happen, and I'm happy that it did, the 747 came out on top, a wise and well-cultured listenership. There were a good number of votes, and a second runner-up was the Concorde. And then I'm not surprised necessarily, but it got more mentions than I thought it would, the DC-3.
Huh.
And the votes there were, it ushered in the ability of folks to fly commercially.
Man, that's tough. The DC-3 ushered in commercial air travel. The 747 introduced long-haul travel, basically, to the world. And the Concorde introduced ultra-expensive, really fast travel to a very select number of people. So each one of those is in its own right quite iconic. I can't tell you which one is right or wrong, but the right answer is the 747.
There you go. So speaking of DC-3s, this is a good bit of information that if you are, in fact, a fan of the DC-3 or C-47s, some of the remaining operational DC-3s are off to Europe over the next few days. They're going to leave Oxford Waterton on the 18th of May, taking the Blue Spruce route, so up through Presque Isle, over to Greenland, Iceland, Scotland, and then down into mainland Europe to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day and the 75th anniversary of the Berlin airlift. The aircraft obviously playing hugely important roles in both of those events. So we're going to be following that over the next few days as they begin their journey, but you can follow along with those aircraft. So stay tuned to social media so we can post those flights as they happened.
Yeah, a whole bunch of transatlantic DC-3 flights. That's something to keep your eye on.
And they'll be coming back towards the middle of June. So that'll be something to follow. So if you are in Europe, you'll be able to see those basically throughout the month of June.
I don't think those will make the North Atlantic track.
No. And then finally, this is now your last week to enter the drawing to win a signed copy of Scott Bateman's book, Hercules. We talked with Scott back in episode 265. So if you haven't listened to that episode with our interview about Scott's book that's coming out about the C-130, by all means, go do that. And then come back and email us at podcast@fr24.com and say, hey, I want to win the book. That's really all you have to do. We'll take it from there. We'll be in touch soon with how to get the book to you if you win.
We might even deliver it by DC-3. Who knows?
We might. That would be fun. That would be a lot of fun.
I would apply to win the book myself if that were the case.
We could just drop something else out of a DC-3 onto your apartment. Not a problem. But yeah, this is your last week to enter. So email us podcast@fr24.com if you want a chance to win a copy of the book. Also email us if you just want to say, hey, you're doing a great job, or you're not doing a great job, and here's what I want to see different. We love hearing from everybody. And I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who, in their emails entering the contest to win Scott's book, have also said very, very nice things about the show. So thank you all for that. We're glad that you're enjoying listening to the podcast, and we enjoy putting it together. This has been episode 268 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.